Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be back with you for another Bible study in our virtual setting. I appreciate your attendance, and I've appreciated getting to see some of you face to face, or at least mask to face at Belle Trace. And if you want me to come and visit you, once again, please let me know. The best way to do that is to let Melissa know that you would like for me to come and visit you, and she can send me a message, and then I have the telephone numbers and I can contact you. Short of that, I'll also be sort of making the rounds and calling people myself. But the best way to get in touch with me, if you want me to come and visit you sooner rather than later, because I'm only allowed one visit per day, and there are only certain days of the week that I can come. I can come on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I can come on every other Saturday. So this coming week, I actually have 4 days. I have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday, all of which would work for visiting. I would love to come out and visit you. My car still knows the way to Belle Trace, so I'm really happy to be wandering the halls again. Not too much, because you want to be safe, and seeing what's up and finding out your stories and finding out what's happening, because you may think that not a lot's been happening, but then when we start talking, I find out there's a lot that I've missed that has gone on there. So I want to know, and I want to be sure that you're doing as well as you can. That's part of why I can only visit one person a day. But if I'm wandering through the halls and I say hi, I can chat for maybe just a couple of minutes before I have to wander away, as long as we stay socially distant. So as long as we're 6 feet away from each other, and it turns out I'm about 6 feet tall, so as long as we're at least one Kurt away from each other, then we should be okay. But I really do want to come out and visit you, and I really do appreciate your tuning in to these Bible studies. And I'm looking forward to the day when we can actually get together once again in person. So I'm keeping the backdrop for today of our third floor TV lounge, so that we can remember, sort of perhaps with nostalgia, when we were gathering together there. And one of the things that I'm hopeful for is that as we continue in this virtual setting, that you will give me some feedback as well. One of the things that I did hear back was that from one person, that the Brick Testament, the Legos that I showed you last time, were pretty interesting. So I'm going to incorporate those again and do it a little bit more as I'm reading. So I'll show you an image, and then I'll read a little bit, and then I'll show you another image, rather than putting them all at the end, so that way we can go back and forth. And the cat may make another appearance. It's sort of over there on my pile of laundry that I haven't done yet. So it's amazing. I want, one of the things that I try to do is I do try to vary the shirts that I wear, but I don't wear them out too much. So my laundry actually doesn't pile up quite the way it used to. But as I'm going out to Ivy Tech now on Mondays, and as I'm actually coming out to Belle Trace, it seems a couple of days a week to visit, I may actually need to do my laundry a little bit more, just to make sure everything is clean and safe. And I'm fortunate in that I have my own laundry facilities here at my townhouse, so it doesn't end up being a problem with doing that. I've had some friends who found, at least for the first couple of months as we were doing the lockdown and quarantine, that became a major issue, because they were living in apartment complexes with shared facilities, and the shared facilities had to be sharply curtailed, or they didn't have any facilities at all and were going out to laundromats, and laundromats were closed, and that can become an issue as well. So in many ways, I feel blessed that I have the resources that I have. And I know those of you that I've talked to at Belle Trace also feel blessed that you have what you have. I know that we're struggling in different ways, and it can feel sometimes a little bit lonely. And when we need help, it can sometimes feel hard to get help because we're trying to stay safe. But in fact, I think we probably have it pretty good in many ways. Especially as I've been chatting with some different friends of mine. I just went out to lunch with a friend of mine who had to move from one apartment complex to another, and they just moved in. And because there was no help in moving, they couldn't find a mover who would fit the bill for a safe move. They had to leave about 90% of their furniture behind. Now, they didn't have great furniture and they didn't care that much about it, except now they're in a place with one bed and two office chairs and a TV and nothing else. So I promised them I'm going to start looking around among my friends who have spare furniture or furniture that is going to be sort of going begging. They need a sofa. They'd like to have a recliner and a coffee table. A sort of breakfast table with chairs would also be nice, and a few other things. A dresser with drawers. That becomes one of my assignments. But you never know quite how lucky you have it until you find someone who is in other circumstances. And so once again, I think that I'm blessed in my life. I'm very fortunate. I think we are, and I'm also feeling very grateful that even though we can't be together face to face or even mask to mask, we can do this virtually until such time where we can get together along the way. I also wanted to let you know I handed a stack of movies to Melissa. So if you like the upcoming movies, you can thank me. If you don't like them, you can blame me. But I'm trying to get a little bit back into the movie business as well. One of the movies that I gave to her was one that I had planned to show right before we shut down back in March, which is the Tom Hanks movie on Mr. Rogers, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And if you know me well, you know that Mr. Rogers is one of my favorite characters. I grew up on his show as a youngster, and I've always found his approach to life to be very calming, very peaceful, and very positive. He's someone who could even take the sharpest of political controversies and make them into something that is simple enough for children to understand what the issue is and what we really should be doing in terms of those things. So I hope you're having a good week. I hope that I know that some of you are also doing Bible studies with other friends and other people, and I hope those are being uplifting and spiritually edifying, as a word I learned in seminary to use, or a phrase I learned in seminary. I'm not the jealous type, so take whatever you can get. But I appreciate your presence here as well. And one of the things that you may not know is I get reports from Philippe. He doesn't tell me who comes necessarily, but he tells me how many people come. The other thing is that YouTube tells me how many people have logged in to look at our video. So I know there are people who aren't joining you in the chapel, but are looking at things outside of the chapel, because week one had 15 different people look at it. And last week, I think, had 12 different people look at it. So we've never actually had that large of a number, almost never had that large of a number in our third floor TV lounge. So there are some benefits. There are obviously drawbacks, but there are some people who are going out and doing some looking on their own. You can count them as part of your spiritual neighbors. So we sort of reach out and connect. You may be, I'm sure you're old enough to remember, I'm old enough to remember, when there were telephone advertisements, reach out and touch someone, and they always meant through the telephone. Of course, we are now supposed to reach out and touch someone, not physically because we're social distancing, but we can reach out and touch each other spiritually through our mechanism here of the internet and through our pixels. And I very much appreciate being able to do this. I never thought I would be a televangelist, but here I am. I don't have the right hair for a televangelist. I don't have the right hair for almost anything. But I do appreciate our being able to do things together in this way. We were in the book of Genesis, and we just finished the Garden of Eden story. And the Garden of Eden story ends with Adam and Eve being sent out of the garden to make a life for themselves outside of that. And so one of the things that is, I think, worth watching, that is sort of worth noting in this, is that they become the first family of the human race in terms of the biblical story. As we're looking at the next story, which is the Cain and Abel story, that's the one that comes immediately following that. Something I've always thought of as I've been reading this is that it's not history in the same way we think of history today. The people who are recording this story, the people who are writing it down and sharing it, are really more in the parable vein than they are the history vein. So when I read stories like this in Genesis, I'm thinking more along the lines of a parable that Jesus might tell us. So what kind of moral of the story are we supposed to be getting from it? Rather than looking for sort of like a dragnet FBI, just the facts man kind of thing. Because there are a lot of things that are in here and a lot of things that we might see are left out. And I'll point out some of those questions as well as we get to it. I'm going to start this week with the Everett Fox book, which is the 5 books of Moses. Oh, there you can sort of see it, 5 books of Moses from the Shotgun book. One of the interesting things is this is a new translation from the Hebrew, and Hebrew doesn't have the name Cain and doesn't have the name Abel. Those are Anglophile names. Those are anglicized names, I should say, not Anglophile. Anglicized names, which means that's the name that comes to us in the English. Just like the name George comes from, like King George the First, King George the Second, King George the Third, who we broke away from. They were from Germany, so they weren't called George in Germany. They were Georg in Germany, but in English it's George. So Henri in French for Henry. Different languages will change names around. So we actually have in this book, as it's looking at Adam and Eve, the name Eve is actually Haba, which is what you'll see in a Hebrew text. And in terms of Cain, it puts it down as Cain. And for Abel, it has the name Hebel. So the people who translated our Bible into English made Hebel into Abel and Cain into Cain. So I will still, even though I'm reading it from the Shotgun book here, I'll still use the words Cain and Abel because that's what we're most used to. But I wanted to let you know that is a little bit different in different languages along the way. And I will begin here, and I will share my screen so that we can sort of see the first image that comes from our Brick Testament. And this is the image that we have here. Let me view the slideshow. And of course, this is supposed to be Adam and Eve. You can sort of see in the Lego way of doing things. They've made themselves a dwelling. Of course, this would have been very primitive back then because we're just starting out with the human race. When we look at things archaeologically, we see that too. And then we also have Cain and Abel, the 2 sons that are there. And it says, when they left the Garden of Eden, it says, Adam knew his wife. She became pregnant and bore Cain. And she said, Kaneti, I have gotten a man as has Yahweh, as has God. And she continued bearing his brother Hevel, or Abel. Now Abel became a shepherd of flocks, and Cain became a worker of the soil. So we have a sort of division of labors starting out there along the way. And the division of labors is something that will persist. And as the human race goes on, it becomes more and more and more specialized over time. But this reflects what we know archaeologically and historically of the major ways in which people lived in what we might consider prehistoric times. Prehistoric times essentially means before there was writing, before anything was written down. And when we're looking at that, we see that lots of people were shepherds, and we have that as a running motif through the Bible. And lots of people were agricultural workers, tillers of the soil. And they weren't always completely separate people. But in some situations, in some societies, they did begin to what we would call stratify. And you would have some people who would be leaders and some people who would be workers, and the workers would separate out into different divisions as well. It also might depend in part on whether the area you're living in could in fact support animals or could support tilling of the soil. If you don't have constant irrigation, you're not going to be a good farmer. If you don't have pasture land and area for the animals to graze, then you can't really be a shepherd. You're not going to be not in that area anyway. So that becomes an important thing to remember, an important thing to keep in mind as we're looking at things. And it says, it was after a passing of days that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil a gift to God. And let's go back to our sharing there. And see, here we have Abel with the sheep. Abel is the shepherd. And here we have Cain growing things in the garden. I like the way the Brick Testament uses the different Legos. I had no idea there were carrot Legos out there, but there are. So here's Cain. He brought from the fruit of the soil a gift for God. And the next verse says, and as for Abel, he too brought from the firstborn of his flock, from their fat parts. And then it says, God had regard for Abel and his gift. And it says, then secondly, for Cain and his gift, he had no regard. And that's an interesting thing, because scholars sort of wonder, what's up with that? Why would God favor Abel and his gift and essentially say no to Cain and his gift? I think one of the clues might be in the phrasing that we see here. It says, we're in chapter 4 of Genesis, verse 4, and it says, as for Abel, he too brought from the firstborn of his flock. And the firstborn of his flock, it means the best parts, the very finest. And that will become something that is important throughout the Bible, and not just in the Bible, but other societies and cultures and religions also had that too. When you're donating something, when you're giving something to God, when you're giving something as a charitable gift to others, you should give of your best, not just anything that's lying around, and certainly not of your worst. And that's what we have specifically stated coming from Abel. We don't have that from Cain. It doesn't say that he gave a lackluster thing, but it doesn't sort of play it up the same way. So we might have a concern that Abel was giving of his best and Cain was just sort of maybe going through the motions. And God says, well, you can do better. I like to think that God in this position would say to Cain, well, you can do better. Because in fact, he doesn't seem to reject Cain outright. He's just rejecting the gift. And I don't even know if reject is the right word that we have here. But so here we have Cain getting upset. It says, Cain becomes exceedingly upset and his face fell. So we see here God is talking to Cain, and it says, God asks Cain, why are you so upset? Why is your face fallen? Is it not thus? If you intend good, bear it aloft. But if you do not intend good, at the entrance is sin, a crouching demon, toward you his lust, but you can rule over him. So here we see God is actually counseling Cain and telling him, I think in many ways, you can do better. You can do better. Don't let anger rule you. Don't let envy rule you. Because I think this is actually one of the things with the Cain and Abel story. Cain gets jealous of God's relationship with Abel because Abel seems to have been able to get in good. Whereas Cain, maybe he tried his best, we don't know. But I think part of the clue for me anyway, as I'm reading in this story, is the absence of that gave of his first, gave of his finest. And I think this, where God is telling him not to let his emotions rule over him. This is, in fact, I mean, think about in terms of the Genesis story, this is the first time we really see anyone getting mad. This is the first time we see anyone getting jealous that's going on. So this is a new emotion to the story of humanity as far as Genesis is concerned. So this is something that we need to watch out for. This is something that is of concern to us to this very day. Jealousy is one of those big sins. You know, you have the 7 virtues and the 7 deadly sins that are out there, and jealousy is one of them. There's a whole Shakespeare play, Othello, about jealousy, the green-eyed monster that's there. And so we one of the things I think of in terms of the Brick Testament with the Legos is they could have portrayed Cain as being green, green with envy. In fact, I'm going to see if I can find a painting that has another picture of Cain in there. So there may be a little clip on the screen, so just hold on. I'm going to look for that painting. And I'm back. I found this drawing. There is a place on the internet called Free Bible Images, and let me share this one for you. And here it is. And one of the things you might notice, this is Cain as the tiller of the soil, the one who grows the plants. And notice how much green is in the image. So we're even using green both as the symbol of agriculture, but also as the symbol of jealousy. So that green is in there. So the green-eyed monster. Jealousy is not good. Jealousy can lead to bad things, and we sort of see that happening in the Cain and Abel story, because of course we know the outcome already of the Cain and Abel story. So what we see next, let me go back to our Brick Testament story here, and we'll go back to the slideshow side. And then in verse 8 it says, Cain says to Abel his brother, but then it was when they were out in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. So here it's sort of interesting as we look at Cain and Abel in the Bible, and we look again and again, Cain and Abel, almost every time that Abel is mentioned, he is mentioned as the brother of Cain. We see that in verse 8. Cain said to Abel his brother. And then it says, Cain rose up against Abel his brother. And then God says, what has happened to Abel, your brother? This relationship is emphasized over and over and over again, in part because it shows that even with family relationships, even with people that you grow up with and you're supposed to love, things like pride and jealousy can get in the way. They can get in the way. So here we have this happening. It says, when they were out in the field, Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and he killed him. We don't have specifics on how that was done. So the Lego Testament is, the Brick Testament is doing this. But then of course we have almost the most famous phrase from this story coming up. God says to Cain, sort of almost immediately, God is there. God says to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Again, emphasizing the relationship. And then Cain says, I do not know. And here is this is the phrase. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper? Now in the Schocken book that I'm using here, it says, am I the watcher of my brother? Or am I the guardian? I have another translation that says, am I the guardian of my brother? I've looked it up in a couple of different ways. But we know it most famously and perhaps most poetically, am I my brother's keeper? And that becomes a large part of the Judeo-Christian message. The answer to that is supposed to be, what God wants us to get from that is yes, we are called upon to be our brother's keeper. We're not called upon them necessarily to sort of dominate their lives and rule their lives and other kinds of things like that, but we are called to care. And the interesting thing, of course, is then defining who your brother is. When we get to Christian times with brotherly love, like Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, that gets broadened into the entire human race. We're called to love each other. But we can see that even when it's a close family tie, from the very beginning here in Cain and Abel's story, we as human beings fall short. God knew that was likely to happen because he's warning Cain before this happens. Don't let it happen. But it still happened there. That's one of the things that we as human beings struggle with. We have the image sometimes of the little devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder, and it's sort of like, which one do you listen to? But the truth is, we've got things going on inside. We don't need the whispering angels and devils. We just need to hear from our better selves about what to do. And of course, God knows what's happening. So as we continue on with the story, we see God asking, "What have you done?" Of course, God knows what's done. "A sound, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil." And remember, the soil, we're still only in the early part of Genesis. This is where mankind came from. This is where humankind came from. This is where Adam was brought out of. And if in the storyline, Adam comes from the dust, comes from the soil, and Eve comes from Adam, and then the children, Cain and Abel, come from both of them. So this is part of their way of living. People used to live much, much closer to the soil than we do today. And we're, with all of our technology and modern civilization, quite a bit removed. Back then, it was there day and night, 24/7. So the text continues, "And now, damned be you from the soil." So of course, the soil is responding to Cain. "You are cursed from the ground, which has opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you wish to work the soil, it will not henceforth give its strength to you. Wavering and wandering must you be on the earth." And of course, there are legends especially in medieval Europe, of these very, very old men who come through, and sometimes they pretend to be biblical figures like Cain or Lazarus or others. Sometimes they're sort of con men who come in and take what they can from the town before disappearing again. And it's sort of interesting the way that works on people. See, we think fake news and con men are something new in history. That is not the case. It's been around for quite a while. But Cain is already aware that this is not a good fate. He says, "My punishment is too great to endure. My iniquity is too great to be borne." That's what the Schocken book says here. "Here you drive me away today from the face of the soil, and from your face must I conceal myself. I must be wavering and wandering on earth, a drifter. Now it will be that whoever comes upon me will kill me." That's always intrigued me, and that's intrigued a lot of people in terms of the sort of the biblical studies, because who is Cain talking about here? If the only other two people that we know of right now would be Adam and Eve, because there were just the four of them, who is he talking about? That's one of the reasons why we don't want to get hyper literal with the text. It's not meant to be a history text in the way that we might think about history today. And of course, what we'll see is God does have regard for Cain, and he then continues in this way. He says, in that case, whoever kills Cain, a sevenfold vengeance will be taken on him. So Yahweh, God, set a sign for Cain so that whoever came upon him would not strike him down. And so we have the proverbial mark of Cain. And some have thought of it as being something on the face. Some have thought of it as being some tattoo on the body. We're not sure exactly what it was. It might have been a birthmark. It might have been something else. We just don't know. But the mark of Cain. And usually it's taken as something somewhat sinister. Here we have Cain setting out away from Adam and Eve, and presumably away from the rest of the family as well. It says, Cain went out from the face of God. And this may be the worst part of the punishment. Cain goes away from God. So in the same way that Adam and Eve were separated from the garden, now Cain is being separated even more by being separated from Adam and Eve, who we're going to assume are living not too far from where they started out, somewhere still in the area of the four rivers that was mentioned. And of course, as we look at some of the oldest cities in the world with some of the oldest writing in the world, several of them are right down there where the Tigris and Euphrates, two of the rivers mentioned in particular, are and other kinds of cities like that. But it says, Cain went out from the face of God and settled in the land of Nod, wandering east of Eden. Now, of course, east of Eden would be in the direction of what we would call Iran or Persia today. So we have, let me make sure I'm sharing this properly with you. My computer wants to act up every now and then. So again, we have him wandering to the land of Nod. We don't know where the land of Nod is. It may be where Iran is today, where Persia has been. It may just be a little bit to the east, so it might be where Kuwait is today. It could be where Pakistan and Afghanistan are. We honestly don't know. There are ancient cities in all of these areas, and that becomes an important clue because the next chapter says, or the next verse, sorry, verse 17, we're up to in chapter 4. Cain knew his wife. She became pregnant and bore him a son. And in the Shochan book, the name is Hanoch. He became the builder of a city and called the city's name after his son's name. And to Hanoch was born Irad. Irad begot Mehuel. Mehuel begot Methushael. Methushael begot Lamech. And of course, one of the things that we see is we have a lineage from Cain that is now being demonstrated in the Bible. We'll have several different lineages that are put out in Genesis. That's part of what Genesis does. One of the great mysteries is, of course, where do all these people come from? Because in the biblical text, as we were reading through it, we just had Cain and Abel. We didn't have any women. We didn't have any sisters. We didn't have anyone else except Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And again, that's why we don't want to get too hyper literal with our understanding of what the Bible is. It's not trying to convey a history in the way we think of history today. So obviously there were other people that Cain was worried about. They know I've killed Abel. He knew it was something wrong, and to know right from wrong implies society standards as well. So we know something else is going on. That's, if you remember Paul Harvey's Rest of the Story, I want to know the rest of this story. I want to know what's going on behind the scenes. But it's one of those mysteries. And I watch Mysteries of the Bible, a TV series on my television while I'm working out. I always have an episode running on that lately, and there was a whole episode on Cain and Abel, and talks about lots of mysteries that we'll probably never know. But we have the rest of these stories here, where we have the sort of the begetting and begetting and begetting. I'm not going to read all of them to you because we have several verses of Cain's descendants. Interestingly, we have several verses from verse 18 all the way down to verse 24. And what we have in verse 23 and 24 is one of Cain's, I think, great-great-grandchildren also ends up killing someone and appeals for the same kind of leniency for God that God showed to Cain. It's like, well, they'll kill me too. And at verse 24, it says, if sevenfold vengeance had been for Cain, then for Lamech 77-fold. But at verse 25, we see the Adam and Eve story again. So we're taking it sort of now, meanwhile, back over here, as television shows might do. It says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and she called him Seth. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew translation here, it is Shet. But Seth is the anglicized version, granted one. That's what it translates into, meaning God has granted me another seed in place of Abel, for Cain had killed him. And to Seth was born a son named Enosh. And then we have a whole list of all the different people who were begats. We have the begats and begats and begats. And we have sort of Adam lived 30 and 100 years. He begat one of his likeness according to his image and called him Shet or Seth. Then Adam's days after he begot Seth were 800, and he begot other sons and daughters. And all of the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So we have these long lifespans that are here. Seth begot Enosh. Enosh begat Kenan. Kenan begot Mahalalel. Mahalalel begot Yered. Yered begot Hanok. Hanok begot Methuselah, and of course Methuselah becomes the oldest man who lived. So he was someone who lived for a very long time. His years, as we see in chapter 5, verse 27, was 969 years, and that's the longest one that's there. But we also had Hanok, which is also another name for Enoch in the anglicized version. He's the one who doesn't die. He's the one who is taken up. And later in biblical texts, apocryphal texts, and as well as some biblical texts, he gets mentioned. There's a book of Enoch that's out there. And it's again, that's one of those unanswered questions. What happened? He was someone who obviously found favor with God in a special way. So his story doesn't have him dying even at a ripe old age. He's someone who simply vanished. It says all the days of Enoch, Hanok, were 365 years, which is interesting because that's 1 year for every day in a year. He walked in accord with God, it says, and then he was no more, for God had taken him. And then one of Methuselah's other sons was Lamech, and Lamech begat a son named Noah. And of course, Noah is someone where we will pick up on a very important story that we're well acquainted with. And that's where we'll leave off in our Brick Testament, because what happens is people multiply. There are lots and lots of people who are out there. And what we see is not only there are lots of people out there, but there's lots of wrongdoing happening out there. And God becomes a little bit perturbed at what's happening. And we will pick up on our story there next time. So again, let me know if you are interested in my continuing with our Brick Testament pieces. It's not available for the entire Bible. And the truth is, at first, when I found this site, I thought it would be really good for children. But then the first time I found it about 20 years ago when I was in seminary. So it's been around for a while. But I also pulled it up for one of our seminary classes, and people were really intrigued. Some people would laugh at them. Some of the images do have sort of humor interjected, and I do appreciate that. Some of them are very serious because they're very serious parts of the Bible. And the Brick Testament does treat the serious parts with a good degree of solemnity and a sort of serious vein that I think is appropriate. So if you're interested in my continuing with that for some of the stories, because the Noah story is also in there as the Brick Testament too, I'm happy to continue that. But I'm also going to try to find some other images. The Noah story is a lot better known to artists than the Cain and Abel story. The Cain and Abel story have a couple of really good images, and I'm going to try to pull up a few more of those. So again, this might clip for a second, so stay tuned. I'll keep you just a couple of minutes here, I promise, before I will let you go. But I want to share these images that I have for you. Many images of Cain and Abel in history have been in the form of mosaics or period pieces. This one comes from the Middle Ages, obviously. We can see both Cain and Abel that are making their offerings together. Notice the dress. Notice how they are dressed and the way they're dressed, including the footwork, the shoe work and the lacings and the capes and other kinds of things. They look like medieval figures. Here we have Cain, spelled with a Y. Here we have Abel, and we sort of see Cain and Abel offering to God their offerings, and God's hand. We don't depict God in medieval art. God himself is typically not depicted, but we have God's hand that is going here. We have to get to the Renaissance and people like Michelangelo with the great image of God on the Sistine Chapel. Before then, we didn't tend to see a lot of that. But here we have that image that's happening. Here we have another image of Cain and Abel. And again, we have sort of Cain and Abel's sacrifices. One of them seems to be connecting up to the heavens in different ways. And the other one seems to be sort of the smoke is blowing back into Cain's face over here. So these are also wearing clothes like one would in certain medieval times. These do not look like clothing that one would wear in the ancient Middle East, nor does this look like a backdrop from the ancient Middle East. So it's interesting the way people bring art up to date for them. Then this is a Titian piece, and Titian did this. We can see it's very dramatic, Cain killing Abel. And we can see the sort of the violence that's here. We see the smoke in the background as if almost as soon as the sacrifices were offered, Cain was doing this to his brother. We see Cain holding a rock up over his head. One of the legends around Cain and the death of Cain is that one of his stone houses collapsed in on himself. And so he was himself stoned, killed by stone, as he might have done to his brother Abel. And then here we have a woodcut that was done in the late 1500s of sort of Cain being cast out. We see Abel lying there. We see God being depicted up here as in a more human form with a crown on his head, with angels beside, but he is directing Cain to go. And Cain is sort of going basically with just the clothes on his back and nothing more. And the clothes that he's wearing here are closer to what we might think would have been in the ancient world, except this again also is not an ancient Middle Eastern thing. The kinds of trees that are back here are much more European trees. So we bring the story into our own lives because the emotions that are used in the story to tell the story are things that we're still dealing with. So we'll pick it up there next time. Thank you for joining me, and I appreciate your attendance and your attention. And as I started out, let me finish with, if you would like me to come and visit you, I would love to come and visit you. I think I have enjoyed thoroughly the visits that I've made with several people so far, and I am hopeful that I can continue to do that with you. Let me know. The best way, again, is to let Melissa know. You can drop her a note or just contact her directly and she'll send me a message, or she can give you my telephone number and you can call me. And either way works, although the message way might work a little bit better. And I would love to see you. Remember, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays in the afternoons, because I teach mostly in the mornings, and every other Saturday. And this coming Saturday is one of the every other Saturdays that I can be there. So again, I look forward to seeing you, and have a good week. Yes, we will have chapel service tomorrow, so I'll be recording that video here very shortly after this.